The first package disappeared on a Tuesday, and I tried to treat it like a weather problem. Something you don't blame anyone for. Something you grumble about, adjust around, and forget. A storm takes down a branch. A gust knocks over a trash bin. A delivery driver leaves a box in the wrong spot, and it vanishes into the rhythm of the neighborhood. I told myself it was normal. That was my mistake. I'm Mark Delaney. I'm 58 years old, born and raised in a part of Indiana where people still wave at each other in the grocery store parking lot and still believe you can recognize a person's character by how they keep their yard. I retired early from a small manufacturing plant after my knees started negotiating with gravity and my hands started feeling the cold in ways they never used to. I live alone now in the house my wife and I bought when we were young enough to think a 30-year mortgage was a lifetime and old age was a far-off country. My wife Ellen died 2 years ago. 2 years is long enough for the casseroles to stop and short enough that the silence still feels like an accusation. The house remains full of her, but not in the comforting way people say. It's full of her in the way a museum is full of the past. Visible, arranged, untouchable. After Ellen died, the front porch became my one reliable connection to the outside world. Not because I was hiding exactly. I still went to church, still met my daughter for lunch sometimes, still took my truck to the same mechanic. But at home, my days narrowed into predictable loops. Coffee, dishes, a walk, a little volunteer work at the food pantry, a late afternoon news program I half listened to, and the slow work of learning how to be a person again without the person you built your life around. Packages gave the porch purpose. A new filter for the furnace, a book from an online seller, replacement parts for an old tool I refused to throw away. My daughter, Jenna, sent me photos printed on cardstock because she thought I'd be more likely to display them if they arrived in an envelope instead of on my phone. Around the holidays, my grandkids mailed me drawings, and I kept those on the fridge longer than a grown man is supposed to. So when the delivery notification hit my phone on that Tuesday, I felt the small satisfaction of routine. A box from a hobby shop. Not expensive, not urgent. Just something to assemble on a rainy afternoon. The kind of small project that makes the hours less sharp. The notification showed a photo of the box on my porch. A brown rectangle resting beside the doormat that still had Ellen's favorite phrase stitched into it. The box looked ordinary, safe, placed there like a promise. I walked to the front door. No box. I checked the steps. I checked behind the planter. I checked the side of the porch where the columns cast shadow. I walked down the driveway and looked near the garage door, as if the delivery driver had suddenly decided to hide the package like a prank. Nothing. The neighborhood was quiet. A lawnmower droned somewhere a few blocks away. A dog barked, then went silent. The street looked normal, which is how theft always wants to look. I went back inside and stared at the delivery photo again. The picture was clearly my porch, clearly my doormat, clearly my house. The box had been there. Then it hadn't. I filed a missing package report through the carrier's website and told myself it was a one-time thing. People make mistakes. Packages get misdelivered. Boxes get taken by wind or rain or wandering animals. Life happens. Then another package disappeared 3 days later. This one was smaller. A padded envelope. The kind that bends slightly and slides under doors when a delivery person is trying to be considerate. It contained a set of replacement reading glasses. I'd ordered 2 pairs because the old ones were scratched, and I was tired of squinting at fine print like stubbornness could improve eyesight. Delivery photo, my porch, my doormat, no envelope. Then a week later, a package from Jenna vanished. Jenna called to check on it because she tracks everything. She is the kind of adult child who grew up watching her parents worry and decided she would handle anxiety by taking control of details. She had bought me a new flannel shirt and a photo frame for a picture of Ellen that she knew I kept on the mantel. I didn't tell Jenna the truth at first. I didn't tell her 3 packages had disappeared. I didn't want to sound like a man who couldn't manage his own porch. I told her I hadn't seen it yet. Then I felt ashamed even as I said it, because lying to my daughter about a box was not who I used to be. When Jenna mentioned she'd insured it through the seller and planned to report it stolen, I admitted it. I told her packages had been going missing. There was a pause on the phone, the kind that carries concern without needing words. Jenna asked practical questions in the way she always does. She asked about police reports and cameras and whether I felt safe. I told her I felt fine. I said it because it was easier than describing the actual feeling. A soft erosion of trust. The sense that the border between my home and the world was no longer stable. The first time you lose a package, you feel annoyed. By the 4th, you start to feel exposed. After the 5th, you start to feel like the porch itself has become a place where someone else makes decisions about your life. In my mind, porch thieves were strangers from somewhere else. People you didn't know. People who swept through and vanished. They weren't the kind of thing that happened in our neighborhood. Our neighborhood was simple. People left coolers of drinks out during block parties. Kids rode bikes from yard to yard. We borrowed ladders. We returned them. Then a 6th package vanished, and the carrier marked it delivered at 11:12 a.m., and I realized the pattern had teeth. I had been home. I had been in the kitchen washing a coffee mug when the delivery happened. I didn't hear a truck. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a doorbell. The delivery photo showed the box on the porch at 11:12. At 11:16, I went outside. No box. 4 minutes. A person had taken it within 4 minutes of it being placed down. That wasn't random. That was someone watching. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the porch through the window. The porch looked the same as it always had. The paint was slightly faded from summer sun. The railing had one small crack I never got around to fixing. Ellen's wind chimes still hung from a hook and moved softly when the breeze came through. That porch had held birthday balloons and Christmas wreaths and the school pictures my kids brought home. It had held Ellen's laughter when she shook the snow off her boots and complained about the cold. It had held casseroles from neighbors after her diagnosis. It had never held suspicion. I drove to the hardware store and bought a basic doorbell camera. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about needing my life to make sense again. When you're older, you can tolerate a certain amount of chaos. You've learned that storms happen, mistakes happen, bodies break down. But senselessness is harder. Senselessness is the one thing grief already gives you too much of. I installed the camera that afternoon with the kind of focus I used to bring to mechanical problems at the plant. Measure, mount, tighten, test. I connected it to my phone. I adjusted the angle until it showed the porch and the front steps. The camera felt like an admission of weakness at first. Then it felt like breathing. 2 days later, another package was marked delivered. I waited. I watched the live feed on my phone, the way a man watches a bank account after a suspicious transaction. The delivery driver arrived, set the package down, took a photo, left. The package sat there. Then, not even 3 minutes later, a figure entered the frame from the left edge. A man's legs, then a torso, then a face. And my stomach tightened because I recognized him immediately. Greg Mallory. Greg lived 2 houses down. He was 51, divorced, the kind of neighbor who always volunteered to help carry heavy things when the neighborhood had a project. He had a friendly grin and a loud voice and a habit of calling everyone by familiar names. He was the guy who showed up in my driveway the week after Ellen's funeral and offered to mow my lawn because he said he didn't like seeing my grass get too high. I had thanked him. I had let him do it once. Greg had brought me a plate of food on Thanksgiving and acted like he didn't want me eating alone. He had mentioned his own divorce as if we shared a category of loss. He had talked about loneliness in a way that felt like understanding. I had believed him. Now Greg was on my porch. In the video, he didn't hesitate. He didn't look around nervously like a teenager stealing candy. He moved with the comfort of a man who felt entitled to the space. He bent down, picked up the package, and walked off, exiting the frame as smoothly as he entered. No sprint, no panic, just possession. I replayed the clip 3 times. I watched Greg's posture. I watched his hand grip the package like it belonged to him. I watched the casualness of it. That was what hurt the most. It wasn't a desperate stranger grabbing a box. It was a neighbor treating my porch like a supply shelf. I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't storm down the sidewalk with the video in my hand. I didn't pound on his door. I didn't make it into a scene. Because scenes are what thieves want. Scenes create confusion. Confusion creates doubt. Doubt creates delays. Instead, I saved the clip. Then I watched the camera log. The log showed other moments that made my chest go cold. Greg had been on my porch before, late at night. Greg had been on my porch in the early morning. Greg had stood near my railing with his phone in his hand. Greg had looked toward the street as if waiting for something. Greg had walked away empty-handed sometimes, like he was checking for deliveries. He had been monitoring my porch. The realization rearranged my recent memories. Greg's friendly check-ins. Greg's offers to help. Greg's casual questions about what I had ordered. Greg's comments about how quickly deliveries arrive and how easy it is to miss a drop-off. I had heard those comments as neighborly conversation. Now they sounded like inventory management. My sadness shifted into something heavier than anger. Anger is simple. Anger makes you feel strong. Anger convinces you the problem is outside you. What I felt was humiliation. Because trust is not just a feeling. Trust is a decision you make based on the belief that a person shares your basic sense of decency. When that belief is wrong, it means you misread the world. It means you were vulnerable in public. At my age, vulnerability is already close. You feel it in your joints and your balance and your endurance. You don't want to feel it in your judgment. I called Jenna and told her I had video. I didn't describe Greg as a monster. I described what the camera captured. Jenna reacted the way I expected. Immediate fury on my behalf. Immediate desire to confront, to shame, to post the footage, to let the neighborhood burn him socially. I stopped her. Not because I felt protective of Greg, but because I knew what public confrontation would do. It would warn him. It would make him hide evidence. It would make him pretend innocence loudly. And loud innocence can convince people who don't want conflict. I told Jenna I would go through proper channels first. The next morning, I went to the police station with the footage on my phone. The officer who took my report watched the clip and kept his face neutral, but his eyes tightened slightly, which is what people do when they recognize something ugly and try not to show it. He asked if I had spoken to the neighbor. I said no. I said I wanted documentation and proper procedure. He asked if I had a list of missing packages. I did. I had dates, times, sellers, order numbers, delivery photos, a pattern. The officer told me porch theft was common and often hard to solve because boxes disappear quickly and resellers move items fast. He told me my video made it easier. He also told me something else that settled in my chest, like cold weight. When the thief is nearby, it often isn't just about grabbing boxes. It's about a routine. A routine. That word followed me home. I watched Greg's house from my living room window in the late afternoon. I wasn't spying like a man trying to catch a mouse. I was watching like a man trying to understand what kind of world he lived in. Greg's garage door opened and closed several times. A pickup truck backed in and out. A teenager rode a bike past and waved at Greg. Greg waved back. Everything looked normal, which is how routines protect themselves. 2 days later, the officer called. They had spoken to Greg. Greg denied. Greg claimed he picked up a package once by mistake and intended to return it. Greg claimed he didn't know why he was on my porch in the logs. Greg claimed he was checking on me, making sure I was okay. I listened to the officer's summary and felt the sadness deepen. Because denial from a stranger is expected. Denial from someone who brought you Thanksgiving food is something else. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges if they gathered enough evidence. I said yes. Then I waited. Waiting is a strange thing after grief. After Ellen died, I learned how waiting can feel like a second life. Waiting for test results, waiting for hospice calls, waiting for the last night that you somehow already know is coming. Waiting teaches you patience you never wanted. Now I was waiting for justice about cardboard boxes. It felt ridiculous, until I remembered what the boxes represented. They represented my connection to people. They represented Jenna's attempts to care for me from a distance. They represented my own attempts to build small joys into a life that had narrowed. Greg wasn't stealing objects. He was stealing proof that the world still reached me. A week later, I received a notification that a package had been delivered. I hadn't ordered anything. That was unusual because I tracked my orders. Retirement gives you time to track details. Grief makes you track details too, because details are the only stable things left. The delivery photo showed a small box on my porch. The label wasn't visible in the photo, but I could see it was light, maybe something in a padded interior. I watched the live feed. The delivery driver left. The box sat there. Then Greg appeared. Same confident approach. Same lack of hesitation. But this time, he didn't pick the package up immediately. He crouched and studied the label. He angled the box toward his face as if reading the name. Then he picked it up and left. That moment mattered. It meant he wasn't just grabbing anything. He was selecting. I brought that clip to the police as well. The officer's tone changed after the second clip. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply more focused. The shape of the case became clearer. Meanwhile, I began to notice other small shifts in the neighborhood. A neighbor across the street mentioned a missing delivery. Another neighbor mentioned a box that arrived opened. Someone joked about porch pirates like it was a funny modern inconvenience. I didn't laugh. Because I knew the pirate wasn't a faceless stranger. The pirate was a man who lived 2 houses down and waved at kids. The third clip was the one that broke whatever part of me still wanted to believe this could be explained away. A package arrived addressed to Ellen. Ellen's name. Not my name. Not Jenna's. Ellen's. It was a padded envelope, light, the kind that could contain paper or a thin object. The delivery photo showed the label clearly enough that I could read it on my phone. Ellen Delaney. My throat tightened so hard I had to sit down. Ellen's name shouldn't have been on any new mail. Ellen's accounts were closed. Ellen's subscriptions were canceled. Ellen's life had ended, and I had done the administrative work grief forces you to do. Change names, change billing, change records. I stood at the kitchen counter and stared at the screen. Then I remembered. Ellen's best friend, Carla, had written me a letter recently. Carla had found a box in her attic filled with old items from their college years. Carla told me she wanted to send me something of Ellen's that I might appreciate. I hadn't asked what. I hadn't pushed for details. I had been grateful for the thought. Carla must have addressed it to Ellen out of habit or tenderness, the way older friends sometimes do, as if names carry love across time. And now that envelope sat on my porch. I watched the live feed. The delivery driver left. The envelope rested beside Ellen's doormat, and then Greg appeared. He approached, saw the label, and paused in a way I hadn't seen before. He held the envelope carefully, almost respectfully, as if he understood it wasn't just a random box. Then he took it and disappeared from the frame. Something inside me collapsed quietly. People can steal from you, and you still tell yourself it's about money. But when someone steals a package addressed to your dead wife, it changes the temperature of your grief. It makes the world feel colder and meaner than you knew it could be. I drove to Carla's house that afternoon. I didn't want to call her and ask her to describe what she sent. I didn't want to make her relive Ellen's absence through a phone conversation. I wanted to look Carla in the eye and tell her the truth carefully. Carla opened the door and hugged me the way people hug widowers, gently, with caution, like you're carrying glass inside you. She asked how I was doing. She asked if I was eating. She asked if I was sleeping. I told her I needed to ask about the envelope. Carla's face changed. She told me she had mailed it that morning and included something she thought I'd want. She described it without drama, an old photograph and a short note Ellen wrote decades ago and never mailed. A note Carla found tucked inside a book. A note Ellen wrote. I felt my eyes burn. It wasn't a valuable object. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't electronics. It was a piece of my wife's voice, and it had been taken off my porch like it was loot. I drove home in silence and sat in my living room with the footage paused on my phone, Greg holding Ellen's envelope. The sadness that filled me was not sharp. It was thick, like fog. It made everything feel slow. That evening, Jenna came over unannounced. She walked into my kitchen with the expression she wears when she's trying to be brave for someone else. She didn't ask questions. She didn't insist I explain everything again. She simply sat at the table and looked at the paused video on my phone, and I saw her face tighten the way mine had tightened. I watched my daughter grieve a second time, not for her mother, for the idea that the neighborhood was safe. Jenna asked to see the list of missing packages. We laid the list out on the table like paperwork for a job, because when something hurts, grown adults reach for structure. Jenna noticed something I hadn't. The missing packages weren't random categories. They clustered around certain sizes, certain sellers, certain times of day. Jenna didn't say what she was thinking, but I saw it in her eyes. This wasn't accidental theft. It was practiced. Greg wasn't wandering and grabbing. Greg was watching schedules. And I realized another ugly truth. Greg wasn't only taking packages. He was taking time. He was taking small moments of relief I built into my days. He was taking the feeling of receiving something and knowing it was mine, that it arrived because someone cared enough to send it. That's why the sadness kept growing. Each missing box was a small loss layered on top of the larger loss I already carried. The next morning, the police moved faster. Not because they cared about sentiment, but because the pattern was now unmistakable. Repeated theft, clear video, targeted selection, denial, a suspect with proximity. They obtained a warrant. They searched Greg's garage. The officer called me after the search, and his voice held that familiar professional distance. He told me they recovered packages, opened and unopened, stacked in plastic bins like inventory. Some were mine. Some belonged to other neighbors. Some belonged to people across the neighborhood. They found shipping labels cut off boxes. They found items separated into piles. Things that would sell quickly. Things that looked less profitable. Things that might be returned if pressure came. They also found Ellen's envelope. The officer returned it to me in a clear plastic evidence bag. The envelope had been opened. The flap creased. The paper inside slightly bent. The officer's face remained professional, but his tone softened just slightly when he handed it over. Maybe he had a mother. Maybe he had a wife. Maybe he understood what it meant to lose and then have something returned damaged. I took the envelope with both hands, like it was fragile. I thanked him. Then I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. I didn't open it immediately. I was afraid of what I would find. Not because I thought it would be missing. The officer told me the contents were intact, but because the moment of opening it had been stolen from me. It was supposed to be a quiet moment of connection, not an item in an evidence bag. Eventually, I slid a finger under the paper and pulled out the contents. Carla's note was there. The photograph was there. Ellen in her early 20s, laughing with wind in her hair, holding a book up like it was a trophy. I had never seen that photo. Ellen looked younger than the Ellen I married, but I recognized her eyes immediately. And the note was there. Ellen's handwriting. Short, neat, familiar. The kind of handwriting that makes you feel as if the person is in the room for a second. The note wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Carla. It was a note about a promise they made to each other when they were young. To never let life make them mean. To never let disappointment turn into bitterness. To keep books and laughter and late-night conversations in their lives no matter what happened. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I sat with my hands on the table and felt grief rise up in a way I hadn't felt in months. Not the steady background ache I lived with, but a fresh wave. Ellen's words had arrived from the past, and they should have landed gently. Instead, they arrived through a crime report. That was what made me sad in a way I didn't know how to explain to anyone. Over the next week, neighbors started knocking on my door. Not all at once, not in a dramatic parade, but in small visits. People came with their own missing package stories, now that there was a name attached to it. People came with quiet anger. People came with embarrassment, because they had trusted Greg too. Some came with apologies, as if my porch being used as a theft pipeline was something they should have anticipated and stopped. One neighbor admitted he had seen Greg walking with boxes down the sidewalk before, and assumed Greg was returning a delivery to someone. Another admitted she had once thanked Greg for bringing her a package, and had thought it was kindness. That detail hit me harder than I expected. Greg had built credibility by performing small acts of help. He returned enough items to look decent. He returned enough items to keep people from getting suspicious. He mixed theft with occasional generosity, because generosity is a disguise that works. The police also recovered items that weren't packages anymore. They recovered objects already removed from packaging, ready to be sold. Among them was a flannel shirt identical to the one Jenna had ordered me. Not the same shirt, but the same size and color. It meant Greg wasn't only taking my packages. He was taking other people's packages too, and the pile was big enough that the same items appeared multiple times. Somewhere in those bins were boxes that never reached people's hands. Somewhere in that inventory were gifts intended for children and grandparents and spouses and friends. That is the part of porch theft people don't talk about. They talk about replacement and refunds and convenience. They don't talk about what it feels like to have a birthday gift stolen before the birthday. They don't talk about the way it turns receiving into suspicion. The court process began. Greg was charged with theft and possession of stolen property. There were additional charges related to the volume and the organized nature of what they found. The specifics were less important to me than the recognition that what Greg did was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. He had built a routine around other people's trust. He had used his proximity to our lives as cover. He had waved at children and carried chairs and brought food and played the role of helpful neighbor while running a quiet operation out of his garage. The neighborhood reacted the way communities often do when betrayal is close. Some people were furious. Some people were embarrassed. Some people were eager to believe there was a complicated explanation, because complicated explanations allow you to avoid the uncomfortable truth that someone you liked was capable of cold behavior. A few people tried to make it about the economy, about hard times, about stress. I understood stress. I understood hardship. I had lived through layoffs and medical bills and the slow, draining cost of cancer care. But I did not accept the idea that hardship excuses using other people's grief as cover, because that was the part that stayed lodged in my chest. Greg didn't just steal from me. He stole from a widower. He stepped onto the porch where my wife's wind chimes still hung. He lifted an envelope addressed to the woman whose name still existed on my doormat. He did it calmly. I kept thinking about the calmness, about how it takes a special kind of cold to steal from a man whose wife's name is still on the porch. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, and I sat on a hard bench in a room that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. I watched Greg in a suit that didn't fit well. He looked smaller than he did on my camera footage. He looked less confident. He looked like a man trying to be harmless. That sight did not make me feel better. It made me sad in a different way. It made me sad because it reminded me that sometimes the people who hurt you are not dramatic villains. Sometimes they are ordinary. Sometimes they smile and carry folding chairs. Sometimes they show up with food and talk about loneliness, and then they use your trust as an income stream. Greg eventually accepted a plea agreement. Part of the agreement required restitution to victims. Part of it included restrictions and supervision. Again, the details mattered for the court, but for me the meaningful moment came later. When a victim services coordinator asked if I wanted to submit an impact statement. An impact statement is not about punishment. It is about record. It is about saying, officially, that something happened, and it mattered. I wrote mine at the kitchen table, the same table where Ellen used to sort coupons and where we used to eat dinner without thinking about endings. I wrote about the packages at first, the inconvenience, the annoyance, the wasted time, the lost items. Then I deleted those paragraphs. I wrote about the envelope addressed to Ellen. I wrote about how the theft turned a tender moment into a piece of evidence. I wrote about how grief already makes the world feel unreliable, and how Greg made it worse on purpose. I wrote about humiliation, because humiliation is the right word when you realize someone close by has been observing your life and selecting what to take. I wrote about the porch as a threshold, and how the threshold had been violated. When I finished, I sat back and felt tired. Not cleansed, not triumphant, simply tired. Restitution can replace a tool or a shirt or a book. It cannot replace trust. After Greg was processed through the system, his house went quiet. No more garage door opening and closing like a machine. No more friendly yelling across the yard. No more casual presence in the street. The neighborhood felt calmer, but also bruised. People started locking things down. Cameras went up. Deliveries were rerouted. A community that once felt open became quietly guarded. That is how one person's routine theft ripples outward. It changes the culture. It makes people careful in ways that cost something. It cost me something too. For months after, every delivery notification tightened my chest. Every time a truck pulled up, I found myself checking the live camera feed. I didn't want to live like that. I didn't want my porch to become a surveillance station. But fear is a habit, and habits take time to unwind. Jenna began sending packages again, but she sent them to locker services for a while, because she couldn't bear the thought of something else disappearing. I didn't blame her. A child's worry for a parent is its own kind of grief. Eventually, she trusted the porch again, not because she forgot what happened, but because she refused to let a thief take more than he already had. That became my own goal too. I refused to let Greg's betrayal infect every part of my life. I still waved at neighbors. I still attended church. I still helped at the pantry. I still accepted casseroles when people offered them, even though accepting help always carries risk now. But I accepted with boundaries. That is what age teaches you when you're paying attention. You don't stop loving. You simply stop giving people unmonitored access to your life. One afternoon in late fall, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the street. Leaves drifted down slowly. A car passed. Somewhere a television played through an open window. Life continued. My porch felt exposed for a while. I kept the camera. I kept the motion notifications. I felt older, because needing those things is a reminder that the world isn't as gentle as you want it to be. But over time, the porch returned to being what it always was, a threshold, not a supply shelf, not a hunting ground, a threshold. The small repairs I never finished became my focus again. I tightened the loose railing. I replaced a cracked board. I repainted the step where Ellen used to trip on the edge and laugh at herself. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because repairing something physical is a way to repair something emotional without having to say words out loud. On the anniversary of Ellen's death, Carla came over and we sat at my kitchen table with coffee and a plate of cookies neither of us really wanted. Carla brought a small book, one of Ellen's favorites, and we flipped through it, pausing at the places where Ellen had underlined sentences years ago. Carla asked if I had read Ellen's note. I told her I had. I didn't tell Carla about the evidence bag. I didn't tell her about Greg holding the envelope on camera. I didn't tell her that Ellen's words arrived in my hands through a police report. I didn't want Ellen's memory to be mixed with Greg's name any more than it already was. Instead, I told Carla the truth that mattered. I told her the note reminded me that Ellen never wanted life to make us mean. Carla nodded. We sat in silence for a while. Not an awkward silence, but the kind that older friends share when they've seen enough loss to stop filling every moment with words. After Carla left, I went to my bedroom and opened the small pouch where I kept Ellen's ring. I held it for a minute, then placed it back. Then I went to the front door and looked at the porch. It was empty, as porches usually are. And for the first time in months, emptiness didn't feel like vulnerability. It felt like peace. The missing packages had been a small crime in terms of money. But the real theft was emotional. It was the theft of simplicity. The theft of the belief that a neighbor's friendliness is always what it looks like. Losing that belief made me sad, because it meant one more piece of my old life was gone. The life where I could assume people meant well. Ellen's death taught me that life can change without asking permission. Greg's betrayal taught me that people can change the shape of your world, too, by taking what isn't theirs and then smiling at you over a fence. I can't erase either lesson. I can only decide what I do with them. I decided I would keep the porch. I would keep trusting carefully. I would keep my wife's handwriting safe, and I would stop letting anyone treat my life like a supply shelf. A few weeks after everything settled, our neighborhood association held a meeting in the community room at the elementary school. It wasn't officially about Greg. The agenda used safer words: security awareness, delivery issues, community updates. But everyone in that room knew why the chairs were filled. I sat in the back and listened while people tried to translate discomfort into policy. People suggested more lighting, more cameras, more reporting. People wanted a simple fix that would let them feel like the old neighborhood again. One man spoke as if we were discussing raccoons getting into trash cans. He talked about inconvenience and the need to be vigilant. Another woman spoke with shaking hands about medication that never reached her porch. Someone mentioned a birthday present that had been replaced, refunded, reordered, and still never arrived on time. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't bring up dollar amounts. I didn't list the items. I didn't offer a speech. I spoke about dignity. I spoke about how the theft wasn't just the loss of packages. It was the loss of the easy assumption that a neighbor's presence near your home is harmless. It was the quiet feeling of being watched. It was the humiliation of wondering if you look like an easy target. I spoke about grief, too, in the smallest way I could. I spoke about an envelope addressed to my wife that should have arrived like a gentle memory, and instead arrived in plastic. The room went silent. Not dramatic silence, but the kind that shows people recognizing a line was crossed that none of us wanted to name out loud. After the meeting, an older couple I barely knew stopped me in the hallway. They held my hand the way people do when they don't have the right words. They told me they were sorry. They told me they had trusted Greg too. They told me they planned to bring over something for my porch. Not a package, but a small wooden bench they had built years ago and never used. A week later, they delivered it. They placed the bench beneath my front window, against the wall where Ellen used to set flower pots in spring. I watched from the doorway and felt something loosen in my chest. The bench wasn't protection. It wasn't a camera. It wasn't a lock. It was the opposite. It was a gesture that said the neighborhood was still capable of being decent. Jenna noticed the bench the next time she visited. She brought my grandkids over on a Saturday afternoon, and instead of mailing drawings, they handed me a manila envelope in person. Inside were 3 new pictures, bright with crayons, and one older picture I hadn't seen. Jenna found it in her own house, a drawing my grandson had made for Ellen during her last spring. My grandson had drawn Ellen and me on the porch together. The drawing showed wind chimes, a flower pot, and a large sun in the corner. The porch looked safer in the drawing than it ever looked in real life. I held that paper for a long time. I realized then that Greg had stolen packages, but he had not stolen the only thing that mattered. He had not stolen the ability of the people I loved to reach me. He had delayed it. He had bruised it. He had tried to turn it into a weak point. But love is not a delivery route. Love finds another way. That night, I sat on the porch bench and listened to Ellen's wind chimes for a long time. The street was quiet. The air was cool. The camera light blinked softly above the door, present but no longer the center of my attention. For the first time since the first missing package, the porch felt like my porch again. End.